Excellent. Thank you. Welcome everybody to our Bioethics Seminar for today. It's a real pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Marcelo Rodriguez Ferrere from the Faculty of Law, who's a long-term friend and affiliate of the Bioethics Centre. So it's really lovely to have you back, Marcelo. For those joining us on Zoom, we'll have time for some questions at the end when you can unmute. And if you just use your raise hand function on Zoom, and you can get in the queue for a question at the end. All right, so I'll give you the floor, Marcelo.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Bioethics Centre. As Elizabeth indicated, I am an affiliate, but I don't spend enough time here. I think the seminar series is one of the best that the university offers, if I'm honest. I'm sure I say that to all the seminar series that I go to, but no, truly, it's great to see such cross-disciplinary work going on such a frequent basis. I've always enjoyed the seminars here, and it's a real privilege and an honour to present again. Greetings to those at home as well. I hope that it's all going to work at home with the electronic version, and please sing out if there are any sort of difficulties. As the title of my seminar sort of indicates, I'm going to talk to you about the developments of the legal recognition of animal sentience. Briefly stated, New Zealand explicitly recognised that animals are sentient in 2015. That should come as a surprise, I think, to sort of any animal welfare scientists or the general scientists in the room, any non-legal scholar, actually, because I think that we all intuitively know in the broadest possible way that non-human animals, it's always a good, important point to recognize that we are animals as well, but I'm going to be referring to non-human animals today. Non-human animals have the capacity to think, to feel emotions of various qualities, to experience affective states in both positive and negative ways. That seems pretty sort of intuitive to us. And yet the law took a long time to sort of catch up to that common sense idea, and certainly to the scientific consensus around sort of animal sentience. What I propose to do today is speak about, firstly, the history of the recognition of sentience, why it took such a long time for New Zealand to get there, and then the problems with that recognition, before finally sort of outlining the developments that have occurred since that watershed 2015 period, and maybe a little bit of forecasting as to what might occur in the future, as well as sort of an outline of the developments that are occurring in sister jurisdictions of ours. This is all in a broader research focus that I've got at the moment. I'm working with a very talented researcher in Australia, Jane Kotzman, who, alongside myself, are editing a text on international developments in the recognition of sentience. New Zealand is part of a broader trend in terms of recognising animal sentience, and there are at least 25 jurisdictions throughout the world that do so. It's become a bit of a burgeoning field, but it is extremely under-theorised as to exactly what all this means. And so the developments and sort of the analysis that I'm providing here today are part of that broader project. The text should be out later this year. So to begin with the history of New Zealand's recognition of sentience. Well, essentially, we have to start with the Animal Welfare Act 1999. It's edging on sort of 25 years old, and it was easily the most important development in animal welfare regulation in this country. Prior to this 1999 Act, we had a series of statutes regulating our relationship with animals and regulating how we're supposed to sort of care for them and our legal obligations relating to that care that were woefully unfit for purpose, just utterly almost abhorrent in their derision and indifference towards animal lives. And you don't have to take my word for it. The Honourable Pete Hodgson, who was an opposition MP supporting the passage of the Animal Welfare Act 1999, well, he described the old legislation as, quote, a crock of old garbage, which I think is as close as you can get to the line in Parliament before you start getting into trouble. Nevertheless, the legislation that came in 1999 was heralded as a major advance. It was cited in both the Times of London and the New York Times as revolutionary in its focus. And that's for various reasons that I don't have time to get into today, but it was considered to be basically world-leading and relatively revolutionary animal welfare legislation. Something that went very much unnoticed, however, though, was a section of the Act that really hasn't had much analysis. Certainly hasn't raised any sort of eyebrows and didn't do so at the time. And in this particular section, which I'll show you very shortly, did a fairly sort of revolutionary thing. It was the first time any common law jurisdiction, common law being those that follow the English tradition rather than the civil law tradition of the Roman law, so England, Canada, the United States, Australia, a few other jurisdictions are common law jurisdictions, Europe and the rest of the world pretty much civil law jurisdictions. It was the first time the common law jurisdiction actually recognized, albeit implicitly, that animals, non-human animals, are sentient. It did so in the provision of the Act, which related to research, testing, and teaching involving animals. It was very lauded, this legislation, for recognizing something called the 3 Rs, which was an idea that animal research should only take place with the purpose and the idea behind it that you reduce the number of animals used, you refine refine experiments to sort of limit the amount of pain that animals experience, and you replace them where possible. It's the idea of replace that we see sort of this implicit recognition of sentience. For those at home, you're not going to be able to see this, I don't think, but bear with me, and this won't take too long, and we'll get back on track very shortly.
I think I would just be able to see what.
Maybe. So part 6 of the Act and section 80 of the legislation as passed had this little reference to the idea of promoting efforts to replace animals with, quote, appropriate, non-sentient or non-living alternatives. The idea behind that, and why this is sort of revolutionary, is that you can see implicitly that recognizes that the animals used within research, testing, and teaching are sentient. Now, no one really sort of commented on this, no one really sort of cared, but that sort of implicit recognition that animals are sentient was revolutionary in the sense that it was the first time that a common law jurisdiction had recognized this as such. Fast forward around sort of 15 years, and I'll just get back on track for those. Fast forward to 2015, and we see a much greater push to take that implicit recognition and make it much more explicit, recognizing that animals that fall within the jurisdiction of the Animal Welfare Act, which is a lot of animals, we have a very sort of broad scope into the definition of animals that fall within the Animal Welfare Act, recognizing that they are sentient. It did so by amending the long title of the legislation. And I promise this is getting close to as much of legalese as we'll get to in this talk. The long title, and we can see it right here, is a bit of a preamble at the start of legislation. It's described basically as setting out the purposes and the intentions of legislation, but crucially, it's not really part of the body of the legislation itself. So it's a bit of throat clearing, essentially. And prior to the amended legislation, it simply listed the ones that follow the major amendment, this Roman 1, the recognition that animals are sentient, and it simply sort of stated things requiring animals to attend properly to the welfare of animals, to sort of establish committees and to repeal this old legislation, this crock of old garbage that I referred to earlier. But the amendment in 2015 inserted this provision here, and it says that therefore, it is an act to recognize that animals are sentient. Now, once again, this is revolutionary because New Zealand therefore became the first common law country to explicitly recognize that animals are sentient. And this was touted as a big deal. The genesis of this reform and how we got here, there was an organization called the World Society for the Protection of Animals, and it's sort of SPCA, but WISPR instead of ISPA. It is now no longer known as that name. It is now called World Animal Protection, and they made a big push to try and recognize for jurisdictions to recognize that animals are sentient. their theory behind this was that once we start to sort of get these narratives and these ideas within the law that animals are thinking and feeling creatures, that attitudes would change and our ideas towards the human-animal relationship would change. It wouldn't necessarily lead to a revolution immediately, but it would lead to an evolution of values in the way that we view animals within society and within the law. And so they were successful here. That concerted push in the preparatory stages of the bill becoming the Act led to this amendment going forward. Now, at the time, I commented that this was not particularly great, and in recent years, I've actually sort of explained why I came to that conclusion in a relatively sort of long article within a couple of years back. I sort of indicated that New Zealand's approach here was pretty poor. And my analysis for that, and the reason why I did that, is that there are two major problems in my mind with the recognition of sentience in the way that New Zealand has done so. The first is that we don't really have a clear consensus within the scientific community about exactly what we mean by the reference to the word sentient or sentience. There is consensus that animals are sentient within the scientific community. There are fringes as to how far that goes on a species level. Research is still continuing as to sort of, for example, whether insects could be sort of classified as sentient. But there is consensus, and we can sort of establish this as a scientific fact that all vertebrates are sentient, for example, but also cephalopods, your octopuses, for example, are sentient. And so therefore, it really sort of depends upon what we mean by sentience to sort of understand exactly what is said with that statement. And so there are a multiplicity of definitions that go around as to what sentience might mean. Emeritus Professor Donald Broom, who's actually delivered a bioethics seminar a few years ago now, is probably the leader in my mind from the animal welfare science community as to sort of what it might mean. And his idea is essentially quite nicely short as well, that sentience simply means having the awareness and cognitive ability necessary to have feelings. A little bit more sort of explanation would be something like a sentient being is one that has some ability to evaluate the actions of others in relation to itself and third parties, to remember some of its own actions and consequences, to assess risks and benefits, to have some feelings, and to have some degree of awareness. That's helpful, that definition, because it says that you do not need a certain level of awareness or consciousness or feeling, simply some capacity to get there. But you can already see that there is sort of a bit of fuzziness, a bit of squishiness in terms of that language. And we can also turn to sort of a non-animal welfare scientist instead of philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, who describes sentience in a fundamentally different way again, who talks less about sentience as sort of relating to particular emotional states or particular physical and mental capacities, but instead something called a capabilities approach. The ability essentially to have life, to have bodily health, to have senses, imagination, thought, emotions, the ability to engage with other members of their own species, to engage in play. Really sort of, I'm being sort of deliberately vague here because it's an expansive idea about how we might consider sentience, and really what Nussbaum describes as the capacity to flourish in different ways. Even if we can't understand what that flourishing might feel like, we can't necessarily empathize with what an octopus might describe as happiness, that doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to flourish in that particular way. And because they have that capability, that is something that we should protect and identify. Now, Broom and Nussbaum are both correct in the sense that these are nice ways of encapsulating what we mean by sentience. And they are correct in their own fields of describing what that might mean, and it has particular impacts within animal welfare science and philosophy as well in terms of the impact of that. But they are rubbish for sort of describing exactly what we mean by sentience from a legal perspective, because it's not included in the legislation. If you would go back to sort of what the long title indicated, it is simply a recognition that animals are sentient without actually specifying what that means. Are we talking about a capabilities approach, as Nussbaum would say? Are we talking about something more specific from a scientific perspective? In case what Broom says, it's not clear. And the problem with vague and uncertain definitions within the law is that they don't have much capacity to bite. They don't have much capacity to mean anything within the real world, which led me to sort of find my next conclusion, that this was largely an exercise in symbolism. There were a lot of press releases that came out when this legislation was amended. There was a lot of sort of good news stories about how New Zealand was recognizing that animals were sentient. As I say, we were the first common law jurisdiction to explicitly do so. But with a lack of a clear definition, and specifically without including it in the body of the act, sticking it up in that preambular part of the legislation, it almost guaranteed that it wouldn't have any direct effect on the obligations of those who are in charge of animals, let alone the status of those animals within the law. It almost guaranteed that that was going to be the outcome. The impact, if it was going to be all felt, was going to be diffuse and indirect. And again, don't take my word for it, although I think I'm pretty correct on this. We can look to the Ministry of Primary Industries and their view on what the change would amount to essentially within the law. This is a quote from their report, which they provided to the Select Committee considering the bill. And the Ministry for Primary Industry says that, look, we already implicitly recognize sentience. There's no tangible benefit to be gained by including sentience. And not doing so would be the best idea, because then we can sort of avoid any unintentional or unforeseeable change to the status quo. Their view was that this was going to be a low impact sort of amendment, that it wasn't really going to lead to any change. Any change that did occur would be unintentional. And that kind of is, saying the quiet bit out loud. Let's simply just recognize sentience within the sort of preambular part of the legislation. Let's not define it. We guarantee that it won't have any actual effect on improving the lives of animals. And that's all okay with us. So I was pretty cynical about the effect that sentience and the recognition thereof was going to have for the actual lives of animals, let alone sort of the way that we regulate that relationship with humans and animals and sort of the general system overall. And we'll see whether or not sort of my predictions have come to pass. Perhaps I shouldn't have been as cynical as I was, but I think that essentially the lack of impact has certainly been something that is felt within this community. That's why I wanted to just focus for the last part of this seminar. By the way, I wanted to make it deliberately sort of shorter and just so we can sort of engage in this proper discussion where the real stuff sort of comes out. But the developments are pretty sort of easy to state. First, there hasn't been a direct impact, yeah? Courts have referenced the way that New Zealand has recognised sentience, but it hasn't applied that recognition in any material way within the Animal Welfare Act and its context within the Animal Welfare Act. What I mean by this is as follows. The Animal Welfare Act provides for a bunch of offences, and they are usually relating to when someone fails in their obligation to provide for, say, the physical health and behavioural needs of animals. It's an important obligation on anyone who owns or is in charge of an animal. But also, for example, offending, which is pretty familiar to most, animal cruelty offending, when someone intentionally or willfully or recklessly engages in conduct that leads to unnecessary or unreasonable pain and distress involving animals. There is a range of offending that sort of comes out of that, and some of that offending leads to prosecutions. Some of those prosecutions lead to cases and case law. Within that case law, there can be, I guess, ways of interpreting particular provisions, looking to the purpose of the act, looking to the general sort of ethos around the legislation. And the most that the preambular recognition of sentience was ever going to have was in that interpretive function. If we recognize that animals are sentient now, perhaps that will strengthen the resolve of courts to take a much more progressive or aggressive approach to enforcing the act. Maybe that would have occurred, but we haven't seen that actually occur. We haven't seen courts reference this recognition of sentience as amounting to anything other than a very cosmetic change. We banned testing of cosmetics on animals, by the way, which is a nice little segue, but that's again truly a cosmetic change given that we've never actually done that in the past, so the ban on it was pretty useless. But it falls within that sort of general rubric of these ideas and these good and easy changes that we can make, that we can pat ourselves on the back on, think that we're a progressive jurisdiction without actually amounting to much substantive change. Certainly within this narrow definition, does the recognition of sentience have a direct impact upon the way that courts recognize the legislation and interpret the legislation? The answer is unfortunately no. But behind the scenes, it's pretty clear that government, at the very least, and government agencies are more than a little bit concerned about what this recognition might mean for the future. The head of the Bioethics Centre, Dr. Mike King, and I had the great pleasure of attending a workshop on sentience run by the Ministry for Primary Industries, all about what on earth is sentience, why did we put this in legislation, how do we get out of this jam that we're in. There's real concern within government authorities about the unintentional impacts that recognition could have. One of those unintentional impacts was a body called NAWAC, which is the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee. They are charged with creating something called codes of welfare, which are, to really simplify it, basically regulations, if for want of a better word, relating to specific species or industries, providing clarity as to exactly how you should care for particular animals in particular industries. And they have changed their processes to better integrate the idea of animal sentience within those creation of the codes. And so this is a very indirect and diffuse impact that it possibly could have, but it does show that agencies within government are taking the change seriously and slightly changing their protocols to account for animal sentience. Certainly, very much after the amendment occurred, government agencies were quite scared and apprehensive about what this change might be, even if it hasn't flowed up to the courts yet with regard to the Animal Welfare Act. But by far, the biggest change that has actually occurred as a result of the Animal Welfare Act's recognition of sentience is in a case, and expressed in a case, that has nothing to do with that act. I'll give you the quote very shortly. It's quite an important one. But the Animal Welfare Act is not the only piece of legislation that deals with the human-animal relationship. Another very important piece of legislation is called the Dog Control Act, aptly named, all about the control of dogs and the regulation of the human-dog relationship. Now, within that legislation, which precedes the Animal Welfare Act by a couple of years, the language that is used about dogs that have engaged in things like attacks or have been caught out of control is deeply problematic. There is a reference, consistent reference within the legislation to the consequences of a dog attack, meaning that the dog will be, quote, destroyed. And for a long time, the essentially de-animalification and the commodification of animals in that way, in particular dogs, by calling it, by referring to them being destroyed in the same way as we would destroy other movable property, is really sort of an indicative of exactly what the legal status of animals are, namely property, nothing more than this pencil, for example. Animals, non-human animals that is, and pencils belong in the same legal category, or at least categorized within that sort of category at the moment. And that is really reflected within the Dog Control Act's reference to this idea of the destruction of a dog who engages in behavior that is deemed unsavory and illegal. So within this context, a case comes up about whether or not a particular dog, the dog's name was Chop, should be destroyed for engaging in an attack. And the case was called Haina and Porirua City Council. And this quote is important because Justice Isaac of the High Court talks about this idea of destruction and how problematic it is now that we've recognized sentience. quote, "The Dog Control Act refers to the destruction of the dog. Such wording reflects the fact that animals have historically been classed as personal property, still are, by the way, that can be destroyed. Of course, most New Zealanders would not classify the dog as an inanimate object that can be destroyed. But I've emphasized here, but neither does the Animal Welfare Act, which recognizes animals as sentient. Although sentience is not defined in the Animal Welfare Act, it refers to the capacity to have feelings and requires a certain level of consciousness and intellectual capacity." Squashed within this paragraph is a number of really important things. And this is often not the case with cases these days. Usually we get case law from senior courts that are sort of several hundreds of pages long, saying absolutely nothing. But within one paragraph, Justice Isaac has really done a number of important things. One, it sort of pointed out for the first time the sort of really odd nature of classifying dogs as inanimate objects in the first place, objects that can be destroyed. No one has actually sort of pointed out that this language is deeply problematic in the courts. And so even pointing this out is pretty interesting. Questioning sort of the status quo about that legal status and kind of the untenability of it, given the fact that animals are sentient, is a huge leap. But then linking this discussion with the fact that the Animal Welfare Act recognizes sentience is really important, because this, in my view, is the very start of potentially a paradigm shift in the way that we think about animals in this country, exactly the thing that World Animal Protection predicted when they pushed for the amendment in the first place. This has nothing to do with the Animal Welfare Act. It's another piece of legislation. But the fact that the courts are taking notice of the changing language and the changing way that we communicate to each other about how we view animals and how society and the law should view animals is pretty important. And finally, the last thing that is really important here is that Justice Isaac defines what sentience means. Now, I haven't included the footnote here, but it is a footnote to the work of Jane Kotzman, the woman that I'm working with at the moment, who is doing some really important work in Australia about locating and defining what sentience means in a legal context. Linking her definition and putting it within law gives us a definition. And if you recall, one of the big problems that I said about the legislation and the amendment in the first place is that it didn't define sentience. Now we have a definition. And it's a pretty good one insofar as that it's pretty nicely encapsulated and decently broad about intellectual capacity, consciousness, feelings, and so forth. So this quote, and this case only came a couple of years ago, really does indicate that there is a real potential for the recognition of sentience to change the language and the way that we think about animals within society. It's pretty important that it occurred. And yet, it's pretty much of a damp squib in the grand scheme of things. If this is the best we can do, and I'm like just searching for gold, essentially in the rubble, then I'm having to do a lot of work 8 years after the fact that the amendment occurred. If it was supposed to be sort of revolutionary, if it was supposed to be a sea change in the way that we view animals, this is pretty milquetoast, thin gruel for us to sort of work with. And that's especially given what's occurring abroad. I just want to note that my strong commitment to a black and white color scheme has been undone by the Belgian flag here, which could be basically any country. But that's supposed to be the Belgian flag and the UK and Canadian ensigns as well. I think I probably committing several offences by putting them in black and white in the first place. I just want to note that I had to make a call as to whether or not I put Belgian in colour. I decided not to, and now I'm regretting that choice. Anyway. Quebec, I didn't even put, I think the Quebecois will be pretty annoyed that I put the Canadian flag there anyway, but nevertheless, the Quebecois and Belgium, not necessarily countries, by the way, known for their sort of strong and progressive record with regards to sort of animal welfare regulation. They have, instead of doing the New Zealand model of preambular and essentially meaningless recognition of animals, have done something quite different. They have recognized the sentience of animals, but they've also contrasted with that with inanimate objects and basically shown the consequences of that recognition of sentience within their legislation. So the Belgian animal welfare legislation refers now as to animals no longer as things, but quote, a living being endowed with sensitivity, interests of its own, and dignity that benefits from special protection. That is far more significant than what New Zealand did, because it attacks the root of the problem. This classification of animals as having the legal status of a pencil rather than something close to, if not the same as, human beings as legal and natural persons. This sort of indicates both Quebec and Belgium both did the same thing, no longer recognizing them as things, is pretty revolutionary in that it starts to create the emergence of a third category. Maybe something called living property, maybe something closer to simply as persons, who knows? But what they are telling us is they are no longer things or chattels. That is so far away from what New Zealand has done, and yet it's the same thinking that Justice Isaac did in that case that I just showed you. This idea that we don't view animals as inanimate property, so the law perhaps maybe shouldn't either. But by far the most sort of significant change that has occurred in the last couple of years has almost unpredictably come from the United Kingdom, even more unpredictably as a result of Brexit. Because as a result of Brexit, the United Kingdom had both the impetus, necessity, and freedom to engage, and I know that sounds a very, very specific part of this. I'm not a Brexiteer, I promise. Forgive me if you are, but not really forgive you. It's a terrible decision. But the one sort of silver lining to all of this is that they did have the capacity to create their own animal welfare legislative regime that is discordant and different from the European Union's. And part of their changes was something called the Animal Welfare, open parentheses, Animal Sentience, close parentheses, Act of 2022. And this legislation, which is now sort of essentially taken effect in the last couple of weeks, creates something called an Animal Sentience Committee. Now, this committee is made up of non-parliamentarians, non-MPs, who have the capacity to run the ruler over every single government policy to see whether or not it has a positive or negative impact upon sentient animals. And that is also revolutionary in a very different way to the Quebecois and Belgian examples, but revolutionary all the same, because that suddenly means that government has the requirement to respond to this committee, explaining why they haven't considered or thought about the impact upon sentient animals within the United Kingdom in this government policy, and having to explain themselves as to why it is an impact that they can justify. This is a really substantial, but also sort of practical way of ensuring that animals and their interests are at the forefront of people's minds. So, to conclude, right, so I don't know what into that last bit, this must be a bit of dust, but the impact is much more than I anticipated. It's more than anti, I guess, as well. Apologies for that mistake there. This is much more than I thought there was going to be, because I thought that essentially the impact would be so diffuse that it would be essentially non-existent, and that the definitional problems would be a real roadblock. The fact that we now do have sort of recognition that it is a change within the law and that we have some sort of definitional texture and nuance within the law relating to sentience is a positive development, but it's slow progress. This has taken 8 years for us to get to a point where it's really not made much significant change at all. And if we look to our international counterparts, we see a very different approach and a far more progressive and radical approach to the recognition of sentience than we do here. Because New Zealand doesn't like to be out of step, especially with regards to sort of animal welfare issues, we've sort of got a chip on our shoulder about this. I think that those developments could flow over into New Zealand and we might see some more significant legal change, at least hopefully within the common law, we might see some change. But nevertheless, it is relatively slow progress as a result of this. So my conclusions here are that the developments in the legal recognition of animal sentience within New Zealand, far and few between, but not completely absent. And that is entirely reflective of the way that we recognized it. But the developments globally really do indicate that this is increasingly part of the conversation, and a conversation that I hope that New Zealand won't ignore. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Marcelo. We'll open it up for questions. So I'll just bring everyone on Zoom. First, we'll just stop sharing your slides, Marcelo, and then we can see everybody who's joining us on Zoom.
Oh, there are so many people.
So
Greetings.
if you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question for Marcelo, please use your raise hand function and turn on your camera if you can, and then ask your question. So perhaps we'll open it up to the room first. Grant?
My concern or query is whether this is a first step in finding animals guilty of crimes against the person when, say, for instance, an animal attacks the person or something like that.
Grant, it's a really good question, and there are several layers to it. For those at home, I hope that you heard that whether or not this is the first step of finding of seeing whether animals have the capacity to have legal responsibilities and obligations such that they could be held guilty for a crime. Two responses to that. I think the first is that you can have greater recognition of animal interests without requiring concomitant responsibilities and obligations on those animals. You can think about sort of the obligations that, say, infants have, the rights that infants have. We still recognize that sort of infants, newborn babies still have the right to life and bodily integrity, but we wouldn't pose many sort of legal obligations on newborn infants, simply just recognize the sort of capabilities that they have. So it's not 100% certain that it would be a first step in going that direction. But my other response is we kind of already do this. And it's nice that you brought that up, Grant, because the reference to sort of the destruction of dogs, for example, occurs when dogs, the owners of dogs rather, have been found guilty and are convicted of their dogs attacking persons or property. The consequences of that is that the human gets convicted and there might be a fine, potentially if it's really serious, they could go to prison, but not often. But within the legislation, it's specified as a presumption, a strong presumption that's almost impossible to displace, that the dog will be destroyed. That's where that language comes from, which means that there is a de facto death penalty for a dog that's been found guilty of engaging in an attack. It doesn't use that specific language, but that's definitely the effect. We sort of recognize that there is a degree of culpability on the part of the dog that leads to legal consequence, which is pretty bananas when you think about it, given that we are so intent on sort of creating those consequences, you do not recognize them as anything more than a pencil. So it seems, if anything, specifically, dogs have a really rough deal, all the obligation and none of the rights. But a very good point. Thank you, Grant.
Josie,
I've got a question about welfare, the word welfare. So, and the relationship between sentience and welfare. So welfare is already quite a big step. When that step was taken to talk about animal welfare,
Great.
That's a big step. And to me, it's sort of, I guess I hadn't thought about it before, but it somewhat implies a kind of sentience, right? So it's
Great.
no longer, so we don't talk about historic buildings having welfare, even though we protect them. So it's an additional thing. So when you were talking about how the NAWAC committee is going through those codes, or the UK's committees, their committee is going to look at various laws and stuff, what additional thing are they going to actually concretely call for or find related to animal welfare that animal welfare laws and animal welfare requirements don't already do? Is it sort of getting away from these minimal requirements around not, that they're fed and watered and not harmed? Is it getting towards things to do with stimulation and so is it kind of like, is Sentience doing a little bit of that pushing welfare further, or like so can you just talk about that?
I always just want to keep just have you keep on talking to us, because I think you're answering your own question, which is which is a great way. Just like I was like, yeah, that's kind of the answer in many ways. You're 100% correct that the shift to welfare is an implicit recognition that animals are sentient, because as you point out, I really like that example of historic buildings, by the way, and I might nab that if that's okay with you, because you're right, we sort of protect and sort of value things in society, but we don't really care about the welfare of those things that aren't living, breathing animals. But we have an obligation to do that when it comes to animals, and it comes through sort of the protection of their welfare. This is exactly what the Ministry for Primary Industry has argued, saying you don't need to make this explicit because it's already implicit within the Act. I think, though, the recognition of sentience explicitly has created a broadening of what that might actually mean. Welfare, as we understand it, is essentially to minimize negative experiences that animals receive. There is an obligation to give them adequate shelter, food, water, diagnose them when they're sick, and handle them in a way that minimizes pain and distress, which is all about shaving off the hard edges of life as, say, an industrial animal within New Zealand, or life as a companion animal. It doesn't do anything to enhance or guarantee positive experiences for animals. And a lot of the chatter within it, my field on this in terms of recognizing explicitly that animals are sentient, was that it would expand sort of guaranteed protection and enhancement of positive experiences. That definitely hasn't come to pass, but I think when NAWAC, the committee you just described, is trying to sort of integrate ideas of sentience within its reasoning, that's what the focus is in its mind, trying to ensure not just the prevention of negative experiences, but the provision of positive ones as well. So you're 100% right in your presupposition that this is just welfare means sentience, but I think that there is at least a theory that says that sentience is recognised as broader than what the Act currently
But that's not,
requires.
you haven't seen any actual recommendations yet from those committees, so you don't know for sure like what actually they're adding on.
Certainly not, and that's why it's easy to be super cynical about this by saying, like, we're considering sentience as what were you considering before, that they were microwave ovens? Like, it's just, to a certain extent that doesn't make a lot of sense, which is why I'm deeply cynical and usually pretty sort of give that committee short shrift with their sort of reasoning. But at the same time, the fact that they would mention it explicitly, if you're not a cynic, might lead to sort of them taking much more sort of progressive action than they otherwise would. One can only hope. Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I feel very interesting and informative. I just have some questions.
Sure.
The first one is, you have mentioned some objection of incorporating the term sentient in the legislation of New Zealand, but I'm wondering what is the rationale, because I feel like it's not very clear the implication of the incorporation of the term. So I'm wondering what is the rationale for the incorporation of the term into the New Zealand legislation. Especially, the second question is that, do you predict that the term sentient can be somehow feasible for in New Zealand and elsewhere legislation, kind of principle of law that will have some implication in terms of legislation or judicial review or something like that? That's my second question. My third question is that you mentioned that you develop a kind of definition. So I'm wondering whether the definition that you develop can have legal implication, like you know what I mean, like will it have any change in terms of the way the law is interpreted or applied or something like that? And my final question is whether the change, I mean the incorporation of the term sentient can result in procedural aspect, for example, relating to destruction of animals, because I see like in the COVID-19 pandemic, many animals are destroyed for the fear of infections. So I'm wondering whether the change will have further implication for the way in which we treat animal in time of emergency or something.
Those are four excellent questions. Thank you very much. So the rationale, I'm going to be cynical here, was simply to look good. That this was something put forward by an animal interest group, and government actors essentially thought, well, this isn't really going to have much of a change, and so we'll just throw it in there and see how it goes, and we can look good by doing it. So the rationale was explicitly not to create significant change from a government's perspective, but nevertheless sort of to look good doing it. The second question, the helicopter prevented me from sort of like hearing it perfectly, so I do apologize, whether or not this might have sort of judicial impact or something like that along those lines. I think for the reasons I said, I haven't seen any sort of significant judicial impact yet, but at the same time, it's much more sort of chatter around it, so that potentially would. I think that the potential is still there. The third question, in terms of sort of the actual sort of legal implications, what this might have on, say, sort of issues in terms of destruction and so forth. I think that this could and does have the potential to sort of amount to change. If we start the conversation by thinking, well, the word destroyed is problematic, and that gets enough momentum behind it to change legislation to take words that don't mean destroyed, or perhaps become more in line with sort of other jurisdictions that don't recognize animals as inanimate property. And I think that will sort of maybe be the first step in the conversation that leads to that sort of major change, but that would be sort of way down the track. And the final thing in terms of sort of just the procedural change in terms of destruction and that sort of stuff, it's funny, times of emergency generally mean that all the nice to haves and all the sort of potential progressive changes that you've got go out the window pretty quickly. And so, for example, it's not COVID, but you saw sort of the response to the M. bovis infection that had been in many dairy herds within the country, that the speed with which that was stamped out, but the swift destruction and kind of a quite sort of wholesale destruction of animals and dairy cattle in that situation was considered pretty much, you couldn't question it, because this is going to infect other animals, and therefore we have to kill as many animals as we can, even if there isn't actually sort of proven infection. An entire herd that had one sort of would have been sort of euthanized, killed. And so I think that if you can guarantee anything in times of emergency, the interests of animals go way down the priority list pretty quickly. Thanks for your questions, they're excellent.
Excellent.
So it's great talk. Thank you. I'm kind of interested in what you had to say about where this might all be leading, and I like the idea of getting a clearer definition and maybe even getting that incorporated into legislation as a future step. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, something I reflect on a lot, even a step or two past that. How useful do you think, and I think you briefly mentioned it in your talk, the concept of granting animals legal personhood status?
Yeah.
How do you think that would change much? I imagine it would be very difficult to do. I think MPI and certain industries would be strongly opposed to granting animals legal personhood status. But there is precedent. We've given legal personhood status to, I think it's the Whanganui River, and a tree somewhere has been given personhood status, and yet we refuse to grant non-human persons personhood. Do you think that would be a useful next step?
That's a great question, Carl. Thank you very much for asking it. Thanks a lot for coming today. It's a whole other talk. So I'll give my brief thoughts. This is related to the conversation and debate about whether or not animals ought to have personhood. And to really sort of prime those that are uninitiated, the way that the common law, so New Zealand legal jurisdictions, but sort of England, Australia, and Canada, and so forth, view this, it's very much in a binary. Either your person or your property. There really isn't much else, and there really isn't a third category. Jurisdictions like Quebec and Belgium, the thing that ties them together is their civilian jurisdictions, and they make less of a deal of that binary. But jurisdictions like New Zealand really hold strong to it. You're either subject or object, person or property. And as a result of that binary, we don't have the flexibility or, I don't know, lateral thinking to sort of engage in this idea of a third category of something maybe like living property, or something like, recognizing that animals might be property, but they are still sort of endowed with sensitivity and dignity like the Belgians do. Instead, we have to do all or nothing. And the problem with that from regulators' perspectives is that the minute that you switch from sort of black to white, 0 to 1, you create all sorts of broader complications. Not dissimilar to sort of what Grant was referring to earlier. Persons, when they are legal persons, for example, Whanganui River is a good example, Te Udawera is another example, that they've got unique and important histories that often get elided, I think, by international commentators. But a really straightforward example is the University of Otago is a legal person. Spark, the telecommunications provider, is a legal person. We grant legal personhood to all sorts of things all the time. So what's the big deal? Well, regulators will say, oh, well, they have the capacity to have obligations and hold obligations and owe people things. As much as that is important, that means that they should have rights as well. Reciprocity and rights and obligations go hand in hand. And animals, if you give them personhood with a view of giving them rights, well, they will never be able to sort of have obligations because they're not that smart, and therefore it doesn't make a lot of sense. Moreover, if we give them rights, then, you know, because they are persons, and if we give them rights that are similar to ours, well, look, that means that, you know, suddenly, what are we going to allow next? A cow to vote or something like that? Those reductive and very, very bad arguments, in my mind, are the big problem with sort of that will always prevent, I think, sort of recognizing animals as persons in the same way as we'd recognize the whangawera or Te Urewera as a legal person. But I'll quickly add, saying like that sort of bad thinking also therefore hopefully allows for more lateral thinking about some sort of third option. And thinking about sort of whether or not animals could be something other than property, other than person in its own third category. Currently, it's pretty untenable in my mind to consider them sort of chattel property. But the shift from the complete photo negative of that seems for our legal systems to be too much of a cross to bear, very much crossing the Rubicon, and that's why it maintains, it'll be a distant possibility. Just finally as well, I don't see it as a panacea either. Whangawera is still pretty dirty. Urewera is still full of sort of unwanted plights on its natural environment. That it may be a good step, but often I think that a lot of the movements that are sort of focusing on this as the holy grail, if we just made a cow person, everything would be solved, is ever so naive in the sense, not in a nasty way, just in the sense of these systems exist that are very, very, very intent on ensuring sort of getting the maximum value out of animals, and personhood wouldn't stop them from doing so, I expect. Sorry, there's a long-winded answer, but it's a great question.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So Marcelo, we have a comment here on the chat.
Cool.
Which you can have a look at. And then question from Wena after that.
Yeah, so we need a landmark case for this to set a precedent for production animals, and secondly, the cultural welfare of minimum standards best practice. Sounding minimum standards are without sentience. Best practice can include sentience, but seems not to as they are currently written. Totally agree with you there, Jess. A landmark case would be what really sort of jolts people into thinking about differently about this. And I long for one every, you know, it's what I hope it's in my Christmas stocking every year. And codes of welfare, I think you're right, they are flawed documents at best, and again, different talk, but I find them deeply problematic regulatory documents, and the way to sort of regulate animal welfare relationships. So the fact that NAWAC is recognising sentience, cool, bully for them, but at the same time, the whole system is so sort of deficient that I do wonder whether or not that will have any significant effect. I guess one.
Yeah, we've got Wena. Go ahead, Wena. If you want to unmute, you can go ahead with your question.
Kia ora, ngā mihi kia koe. Interesting talk. I just have two questions for you. I don't know if they're particularly well-formed or good questions, but I'll just ask them anyway. For my own research, I'm doing my PhD now. In my study, I interviewed one of the animal rights advocates, and she's a lawyer, and she detailed a case which is an ownership dispute between a couple that has separated over a dog. So the person who was left without the dog was offered a reparation by the court of a few $100 based on how much they have purchased the dog for. So there's something deeply, the idea is that there's something deeply unjust about that. So I was wondering what you thought sentience might provide in that case, addressing that sense of injustice. And the second question I have for you is what do you think the potential that, while we're already seeing the conflicts between the Wildlife Act and the incorporation of sentience, and I'm thinking about the culling of predators, sentient predators, to protect sentient native species. And I was wondering what you thought about the potential conflict that the Animal Welfare Act in recognizing sentience would have with the Wildlife Act.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you very much for both of them. I'll answer the second one first. There's like a complete disjunct between the Wildlife Act 1953 and the Animal Welfare Act. to the point where they don't sort of really sort of make much sense together. You know, one sort of recognizes that animals are sentient and therefore the concomitant values, I guess, of having positive and negative emotional states. The Wildlife Act declares some animals as important and some as basically, you know, so legally unimportant that they can be destroyed willy-nilly. The idea of protection of some and sort of basically unprotection of others is pretty discordant with the idea that we regulate now. But that's just something reflective of the Wildlife Act being a piece of 1950s legislation, not necessarily because it's been well thought through. It's really in need of reform. The first issue, I wonder if you could just get a clarification. Was this case within New Zealand?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting because we've got a bunch of case law that actually departs from the idea that animals, for the purposes of relationship property division, are simply like the microwave oven or the priceless work of art or something like that that's being that's divided. I don't know why priceless works of art are part of relationship property division, not usually in my experience. But anyway, the court has said essentially that they treat companion animals for that purpose not as who bought it, right? Who bought it, because that would usually be the situation, who would have a greater sort of moral claim to the chattel, and then you get reimbursed for the value if you're not the lucky recipient of the painting or something like that. Instead, the court looks at what would be in the best interests of the animal. And there are more than a few cases that say, like, look, the partner X has a greater emotional commitment to the family dog, but partner Y lives on a farm, and partner X is moving into an apartment. Partner Y will be able to provide for a better existence for the dog. Therefore, partner Y gets the dog. Now, that happened independent of any recognition of sentience and hasn't actually been tied explicitly to the idea of sentience, and yet it's a core reflection of enhancing the dog's life, of enhancing the sort of best interest of the companion animal in such a dispute. A really good example of what that might mean in a practical way. But the kicker is, as you say, well, still the consequences of that is that the partner that doesn't get the dog just gets the money for how much the dog cost. So it's that immediate sort of kickback and sort of yank back to reality of the law still recognizes this as chattel property with a value. So yeah, it's a really interesting example that you've raised, and thank you for raising it.
Yeah, so perhaps just the final, we've got time for just this one last question from the chat about another inconsistency there.
New Zealand is getting rid of New Zealand's getting rid of hen cages, but what is happening about domestic bird cages that allow no flying, for example? Thanks for your question, Margaret. Well, we're not really getting rid of cages. We're just allowing for sort of bigger cages at the moment. So we phased out battery hen cages, but we still allow something called colony cages, which is still lots of chicken. But you know, the great sort of eventual sort of push, and certainly sort of there is a big push from consumers about sort of cage-free chicken. So I should sort of point that out. Would be, I guess, that it would be the barn-raised or free-range chickens. Huge anomaly in that there is essentially no restriction on companion animal birds from being within cages. It's not a sort of a major problem, I guess, on the policy sort of agenda, and that's probably why it doesn't get like a lot of attention. But there are so many anomalies and sort of inconsistencies with the way that we treat different species of animals depending upon what we're using them for, that it would be that this is only one of many inconsistencies that we can see. I mean, the treatment that we allow for a dairy cow versus, say, your companion moggy is, you know, they may as well be completely different. Well, they are different species, but they may as well be different categories of property, given the requirements we place on them. So yeah, these inconsistencies abound within this particular area of the law.
Thank you so much. I think that takes us to time. So for us to thank Marcelo for a fantastic presentation.
Happy to chat after this as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to everybody on Zoom. Really appreciate you coming along.
We have a seminar next week. We have Angela Ballantyne, who is a member of the centre from Wellington, who'll be presenting online. Yeah. So we do have a seminar next week. You're welcome to join us. There'll be advertising coming out tomorrow.
Thanks,
Thank
mate.
you for coming. Thanks so
Appreciate it.
much, Marcelo. I will, there's one final comment on here if you want to look.